If you came across this podcast, you may have typed in, "Do you know him?" If so, who or what are you looking for in life? If you'd like to talk to someone about this, or if there is something you'd like to hear about in a future episode, then please email us at doyouknowhimpodcast@gmail.com. And now on to today's episode.
Welcome to the Do You Know Him podcast. This is Lowell King, and I'll be your host. I've entitled today's story, "Here I Come to Save the Day." Well, some of you might recognize that intro. That is the cry from the cartoon character Mighty Mouse. Mighty Mouse was a cartoon that I grew up with when I was a young man, and I'm sure some of you might remember him. He was kind of a miniature Superman with this mouse that was had the capability of flying and had this amazing, powerful punch that he would use on the villain who was trying to take advantage of the damsel in distress. And the stories were repetitious, but always had a little different setting that they were in, but it always came down to the same situation when Mighty Mouse would show up out of nowhere and save the damsel who was being taken advantage of. Well, in this particular story, Mighty Mouse does play a role, believe it or not, but he's not the one who comes in and saves the day. And I'll share that with you as we go into the story, and you'll start to understand what I'm talking about. Well, this particular time in my life that this story is the setting is during my teenage years, between my my junior and my senior year. After growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area in California, my mother and father moved down to Los Angeles. We settled in a small town called Sunland, a sister city called Tujunga. They were kind of Sunland, Tujunga area, and they were located in the foothills up above the San Fernando Valley. I attended Verdugo Hills High School there, my sophomore, junior, and senior years, and played football and worked and went to school. The typical teenage type situation. We all did pretty much the same thing, and of course social life were parties and dates on the weekends. It was a demanding schedule, to be quite frank with you, and I was always tired, but somewhere or another, as teenagers, we get through it. But in this particular day, was a typical day during the summer. I was not going to school at that time, but I was working almost full time. And this particular day, I had worked 8 hours, and I had been out on Friday night. So I got at home late on Friday night and worked all day. And now I was going out on another date on Saturday night. And I was pretty tired, to be quite frank with you. I had just acquired my first car. I affectionately referred to her as the Blue Bomber. She was a 1947 Chevy, and it was typical of the kind of car that you might see teenagers driving in those days. We drove older cars. We couldn't afford to buy a new one, obviously. And this particular car was painted metallic blue and had the what we call scavenger pipes, which were basically an extension from the muffler of a chrome pipe that gave a real mellow sound that kids used to love to hear. With the glass pack mufflers, of course, made it pretty loud, but it was what teenagers love to have on their cars. I was kind of laughing the other day. I heard a song by George Strait, the country singer, and the name of the song is "I Got a Car," and that's kind of what reminded me of the Blue Bomber. In the song, the boy is trying to impress the girl, and he says, "Well, I got a car," and she says, "Well, there's something," and then she said, "At least it's a start," and then he said, "It's better than nothing." And that was pretty much my attitude. I kept the Blue Bomber washed and clean as I could. and it was a great transportation car. It took me all over the country that I lived in, pretty much California. It took us down to uh, Mexico, down as far down as Ensenada. Went to Las Vegas a couple of times. Went to Yosemite Park. Uh, so pretty much the car would, get us around, and no matter what might go wrong with the car, it seemed like we always had a way between myself or my friends that were with me, whatever. We'd get the car fixed and get it moving. And cars were a lot more simple in those days. I mean, you could actually work on them yourself. Um, you didn't have to have a mechanic or have a big bank book or a credit card. Those were almost not even available to young teenagers, that's for sure. Well, anyway, in this particular day, I had completed my day at work, and I took off directly from work to pick up a young lady to go out to have something to eat and go to a movie. It's the first time I'd ever gone out with her. I knew her, but I didn't had never gone on a date with her. So this particular evening, went down and picked her up at her home, talked to her parents, told the parents that I'd have her home by midnight, and off we went to get more than likely hamburgers and milkshake and French fries. That was a typical meal in those days, and it was a really warm. I remember almost, I guess you could almost call it hot summer evening. And so we had the windows down on the car as we pulled into the drive-in theater. And we were really looking forward to seeing this particular movie that was playing that night. And so we pulled in and set up the speakers in the windows like they used to have in the old drive-in theaters, and got all set for the movie. And the movie started, and I hate to admit it, but I couldn't even begin to tell you what the movie was about, or even what the name of it was at this point. I fell asleep about 20 minutes into the movie, and I was out like a light. I guess just the exhaustion of the schedule I was trying to keep just overtook me, and I zonked out. I was totally out. I can only assume that either she was tired too, or maybe she was totally bored. But between the two of us, we both fell asleep. And all of a sudden, at 1 a.m., I woke up and I realized how late it was. There was no other cars in the drive-in theater. No one had even bothered to knock on the window or say, hey, you need to get out of here or whatever. We just simply fell asleep and nobody came and told us, so we stayed there and slept. And we had what I call a wake up little Susie moment. If you're familiar with that song the Everly Brothers did, talking about two kids that went to the theater, didn't do anything wrong, they just simply fell asleep and woke up, and they were later than they should have been in getting the young girl home. And that's exactly what happened to us that night. Here it is, 1 o'clock in the morning, and I was supposed to have her home at midnight, and now I'm still 20 minutes away from her house. And when I woke her up, she was absolutely devastated that it was that late, and she realized that she was in big trouble with her parents. So I said, well, I'll try to explain it to your dad. And so we took off and went to her house. We got there in about 1:20, between 1:20 and 1:30 in the morning. And I don't believe she had a key because her dad wound up coming to the door, and he's in his pajamas, and I'm trying to explain to him, what happened, and how badly I feel about the fact that, we were just too tired and we just fell asleep. And all he wanted to do was get back to bed. He said, yeah, okay, I'll deal with this tomorrow. And he looked at her and he said, I'll talk to you tomorrow about this. You go to bed. And so off I went, and I thought, well, boy, I really got her in a jam here. I felt really bad about it. Well, anyway, as I was walking back out to my car happened to be right under a streetlight. And so as I started to get in the car, for some reason I glanced back at the house, and I saw the lights all go out in the house, so I knew everybody was going back to sleep. And then I looked down, and sure enough, my my left rear tire was flatter than a pancake. And I thought, oh my gosh, and I'm thinking not only the noise of trying to change the tire, but just the fact that I'm already beyond exhausted, and I just wanted to get home and get to bed so I could go to work the next day. And I didn't know what I was going to do. Anyway, I went back and I opened the trunk, and I always had a tire. I always had a spare tire. I used to buy these tires at the gas stations that were behind the gas stations in those days, which were tires that somebody had decided to put new tires on their car, and then they take tires sometimes that had tread on them, and they'd put them behind the gas stations who did most of the tire sales in those days. And young people like I would come by and try to find a tire that would fit the car, and usually $5 to have it mounted on a wheel. So I always had at least one or sometimes two of those $5 tires, available to me. And I got the tire out, and then I looked and I realized I didn't have my jack, and I didn't have my lug wrench. And so I'm thinking, well, I can't change the tire. Well, I have to tell you where this home was located. It was in a housing development in the San Fernando Valley, and I remember when I went down to find the house to begin with, I had to make about 6 or 7 turns, and it almost seemed to me that this house was actually located almost in the middle of this development. And I was even thinking when I was driving back to her house, trying to figure out if I could remember how to get back out of there and get home. There was houses in every direction for probably a mile or two. There was no gas stations. There were no stores. There were no telephones. In those days, of course, we didn't have cell phones. So here I am stuck in the middle of this housing development with no jack, no lug wrench. I had $2 in my pocket, no telephone, and I'm just sitting there trying to figure out what in the world am I going to do about getting this tire changed. Well, finally I built my courage up, and I realized there was only one answer. I just had to go back and ask whether or not her dad would lend me a jack and a lug wrench. So I go back and I knock on the door, and it was amazing how graceful he was about this whole situation. He came out and got the jack and got the lug wrench, almost as if I'm already awake, might as well help this guy. And he told me that when I was done to just put it on the porch. It was exactly what I did. And probably about 20 minutes later, I was back on the road. So by this time, it's well after 2 a.m. And I can think back on my life, only one other example that I can think of when I was this tired, maybe two. But this was one of those evenings where I was just beyond exhaustion. And all I wanted to do was get home and get in bed so I could go to sleep. I hadn't even thought about a cat nap or anything like that, but I should have probably done that, but I didn't. So as I was driving back, I believe on a road called Foothill Boulevard, heading up towards Sunland, there was an area there that I had to cross over. It was like we used to call it the wash, or the Big Tujunga Wash. I really don't know the official name of it. That's what we called it. And it was an area that water would come down out of the mountains in the wintertime, and it would become like a raging river, almost like the Mississippi River. And sometimes it would even have so much water it would actually flood the road. But it was a long distance there, and I don't know, probably about a quarter of a mile, if I remember correctly, where this water would come down like a river, and in the wintertime. But in the summertime, it was just dry as a bone. But there was a bit of a drop off, probably in some areas 20 to 30 feet from the road down to the bottom of the wash where the water would be coming down from. And as I was traveling along there on Foothill, there wasn't really a wall that along that portion of the road. There was a guardrail, and but there were sections in, for whatever reason, where the guardrail wasn't all the way. It would be a little part of it would be guardrail, and then other parts would be open. And so, anyway, as I was proceeding along there, I was so tired, and unfortunately, I fell asleep. I fell asleep at the wheel, and I'm probably doing 55 or 60 miles an hour, and I'm literally sound asleep. That's the best way I could put it, because I don't really have any recollection except for what occurred in just a few minutes or a few seconds later. Asleep, and all of a sudden, I begin to hear this noise that reminds me of this big saw that in the lumber yard that the villain would tie the damsel onto a log. Never understood why he would do that or why he would want to cut this poor pretty little girl in half, but that's exactly what the villain would do. And of course, Mighty Mouse would fly in and singing, "Here I come to save the day." And he would come in and he would break the ropes, take the girl off the saw mechanism, and then he would punch the villain out and knock him unconscious. And that was the story over and over again. So in this particular few seconds that were going on here, I hear this saw, and all of a sudden I am seeing this story or dream or whatever you want to call it in my mind of Mighty Mouse coming to the rescue. And the sound of the saw and whatever kind of brought me back to consciousness. And I looked over to my right, and it looked like the 4th of July was going off. I saw sparks everywhere. It was like they were just shooting off the side of my car. And I'm still half asleep and half awake. And I realized what was happening was I was actually riding on the guardrail. My car at 55, 60 miles an hour is riding along the guardrail, and the metal screeching noise that I was hearing was my car rubbing against the metal on the guardrail. And then I looked up and realized I was almost at the end of the guardrail, within a few feet. And at the last second, I pulled the wheel to the left. And I avoided going off the road into the wash area, the drainage or whatever you want to call it, the canyon type of place. It was probably a 20 to 30 foot drop off there. Well, in those days, we didn't have seat belts. That was not even a consideration. I don't even remember anybody ever even talking about seat belts in those days. And I can only imagine that if I had not pulled my wheel to the left at the last second, that not only would the car have been totaled, but I probably would have died in the process. And thinking back on that story, almost like the story of what occurred when I was lost in the forest, I came to the realization that God always knows where we're at. He knows our circumstances. And for whatever reason, sometimes he intervenes, and he will do things to help us avoid the consequences of some bad decisions. In my case, obviously, I shouldn't have been driving as tired as I was. But it seems like, I don't know whether, looking back, does this mean that at that moment I was saved this horrible, tragic accident, so that I could be telling you the story today, that there is a God and that he loves you and that he cares about you, and he's right there. He's waiting to come to your rescue, so to speak, if you ask him to. I really don't know the answer to all of this. All I know is it happened. I know that in my faith, I guess you'd call it, I believe, looking back, that God did intervene, that he did wake me up, that he did let me know that even at the last second to pull the wheel away from going over the road and down into this little canyon area. And I'm so grateful he did. So, this is Lowell King. I just wanted to ask you again, and I'll be doing this each one of these podcasts. The most important question that anyone in your lifetime will ever ask you: do you know him?